Crafting a piece of art and releasing it into the world takes guts, and video games are such a big time investment for developers and publishers that if it doesn't meet expectations, that can be devastating, both personally for those that poured their heart and soul into it, but also from a financial standpoint. The industry is constantly moving, and there are times where video games might not get a second chance, no matter how badly they deserve it. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 awesome recent video games that didn't deserve to bomb. Number 10, Guardians of the Galaxy. Considering how the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been one of the most valuable entertainment properties of the last decade, you'd think we would have had more high-budget video game tie-ins or adaptations. Still, even though they wouldn't be using the actors' likenesses, there was some excitement when Square Enix started working on several Marvel products. Square claimed that, even though the game came in at number 2 on release, only behind FIFA, Guardians of the Galaxy had undershot sales expectations, which is a shame and sadly a common situation with the company's Western releases. There's a couple of reasons why this might be that include a marketing campaign and presence that was perhaps a little too overbearing, and the fact that it was coming not all that long off the back of Marvel's Avengers. That game also undersold Square Enix's projections, and the critical reaction to Avengers was a lot more divisive. It's a shame because Guardians doesn't have nearly the amount of issues that Avengers had with its grinding games-as-a-service approach, and was a more streamlined affair geared towards a good linear campaign. Despite the lack of big-screen actors, Guardians' characters were all well written and identifiable, a goofy but human story amid high-octane combat. Number 9, The House of the Dead Remake. If you're of a certain vintage like me, you may well have fond memories of visiting the arcade and not being able to resist popping your pocket money into a House of the Dead cabinet. Instead of pitching a new title, developer Megapixel Studio instead opted to remake the original game, which has been notoriously locked on old PCs and Sega Saturns for decades. The House of the Dead remake is a pretty faithful return to the 25-year-old game that offers the kind of ridiculous co-op zombie blasting fun you'd expect, along with some new options to give it some extra replayability, all in a bright and bold new art style. Criticisms of its awkward controls are fair, but many thought the game was short and outdated, which, considering it's a remake of an arcade title from the late 90s, begs the question, what were you expecting? Considering Megapixel are set to remake fan favourite The House of the Dead 2 next, hopefully the legitimate control and tech issues are something they can address moving forward. That being said, for a new studio to handle a beloved game so respectfully is always nice to see, and House of the Dead Remake isn't anything more than it needs to be. Number 8, Aliens Fireteam Elite. In this lobby, nobody can hear you scream, because the player base have moved on. Aliens Fireteam Elite actually sold reasonably well at first, being the best-selling game in the UK on its release week in August 2021, and hitting about 15,000 concurrent players at launch. But developers Cold Iron Studios failed to maintain the momentum, and now barely 200 people play the game only 9 months from its release. Cold Iron's roadmap for content unfortunately doesn't seem to be taking the game's criticisms into account. Adding more weapons and cosmetics is fine, but most players would rather the studio fine-tune the AI, construct more story missions, or, what should be standard for a multiplayer experience in 2022, add crossplay. Fireteam Elite is fundamentally a fun game, an action-packed team-based shooter that retains the alien tone and scare factor, with enemies that can come out of anywhere and break down your defences. The game's multiple classes are all rewarding in their own right, and so is the challenge card feature, which offers bigger prizes for a tougher experience. And, if you're a fan of the franchise, the game handles the lore of the series tremendously well. Whilst its general audience moved on quickly, Aliens Fireteam Elite is still a blast to play if you can rally up some friends. Number 7, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Whilst it wasn't quite as faithful an adaptation as Resident Evil 2 Remake, Jill's fight to escape Raccoon City was another visual triumph for the RE engine. Additionally, it revitalised several dormant Resi characters. Valentine herself hadn't been seen for 11 years by this stage, and it reinvented the sometimes boring, sometimes sexist Carlos into a boundary-respecting, lovable himbo. The gameplay basics are as strong as the former remake, but with a relaxed sense of horror and a slight increase in the action, much like the original RE3. Jill has an incredibly satisfying dodge move that allows her to roll out of the way of incoming attacks and pop off a few shots in return. Whilst criticisms were made regarding its length, most don't seem to realise that the true joy of Resi 3, like many of the series' oldest titles, is in its replayability, honing your skills to beat your best time and additional difficulty settings. Landing just 1 year after the award-winning Mr. X meme-creating classic that was Resident Evil 2 Remake, it had a tough act to follow. Audiences were pretty satisfied with what they'd already experienced and didn't turn out for its follow-up, which of course arrived in early 2020 at the start of the pandemic. Not many people were all that keen to play a game about a virus for obvious reasons. Number 6, Titanfall 2. Most people agreed that the original Titanfall was an awesome concept that largely delivered, so when a sequel was revealed, most were optimistic. The multiplayer portion of Titanfall 2 did so much right, including the most important thing of all, listening to your audience. The progression system was more robust than the first game, gameplay was less chaotic and allowed players to make worthwhile decisions on the fly, and maps were deeper and more interesting. Additionally, Titanfall 2, unlike the original, shipped with a campaign. It wasn't anything mind-blowing and got some pretty mixed reactions, but the fact that it was there at all was nice. Even if the story was just fine, the gameplay was fun enough that the campaign was worth experiencing. EA have said since the release that they're happy with the positive reaction that Titanfall 2 garnered. That's good to hear because it's pretty much on them that the game didn't sell as well as it could have and should have, only moving about 10 million copies in its first year. EA decided to launch Titanfall 2 a week after Battlefield 1 and a week before Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, both hotly anticipated releases from franchises with far bigger pedigrees. Titanfall, a scrappy underdog of the FPS genre, was always going to get overlooked by players who would have put their main squeeze first. Number 5. Metroid: Samus Returns. At E3 2017, Nintendo announced that Metroid was to return in a big way, with both the still upcoming Metroid Prime 4 and the extra added surprise of Metroid 2 Return of Samus getting a 3DS remake that September. Rebranded as Metroid: Samus Returns, it took the most disappointing and dated game in the franchise and brought it to life again using the 3DS's wonderful visuals. The game rides the fine line of faithfulness and freshness, the titular hero now equipped with a new counter-attack which only adds to the game's overall fluidity. Finally, Metroid 2, once trapped on Game Boy, was now flying free. Despite all this, the sales for Samus Returns were not all that promising for a major Nintendo IP, especially one returning after such a long absence. Perhaps due to the waning interest in the 3DS, Samus Returns never topped any charts, landing at number 8 in the UK and number 3 in Japan in its first week. Thankfully, the announcement of Metroid Dread not only bumped those sales up, but the Nintendo Switch entry swooped in to more than make up for the loss in sales. Hopefully this secures Mercury Steam's value in Nintendo's eyes, but even with the success of Dread, we shouldn't forget the beautiful simplicity of Metroid: Samus Returns. Number 4. Days Gone. Sony's biggest power move in recent years has been its exclusives, and whilst we all rightfully sing the praises of Spider-Man and Horizon, it's Days Gone that deserves more love than it gets. Upon release, critics were unimpressed, stamping pretty middling review scores on the game and complaining about its lackluster story and repetitive missions. The public seemed to disagree, however, giving the game much higher numbers than the average Metacritic score. It's possible that critical expectation was too high, as most who played the game pushed back at the idea that Days Gone world was boring, and just because it hadn't reinvented the wheel doesn't mean that it wasn't worthwhile. Similarly, just because its narrative wasn't as expertly delivered as The Last of Us doesn't mean that the game deserves total admonishment. If nothing else, and maybe this is controversial, but speaking on that comparison, Days Gone has some much more engaging combat encounters than The Last of Us. Unexpected zombie run-ins that turn into huge showdowns or escape attempts are always tense and satisfying. Technical blips at launch were also quickly ironed out, which means that this beautiful open world now runs smoothly. Despite its review scores, Days Gone sold pretty well indeed, so fingers crossed that this isn't the last we see of Sony's post-apocalyptic survival adventure. Number 3. The Wonderful 101. Whilst we all love to see our favourite franchises and characters return, there's something special about new IPs, and they deserve all the chances they can get to succeed. After all, if we don't let artists create something new, then the industry stagnates. Not only was The Wonderful 101 a new property from Platinum Games, but its innovative gameplay idea was fresh and instantly engaging. An isometric action game, players control a horde of superheroes and navigate stages to save citizens and solve puzzles by morphing their horde shape as it grows. Nintendo pushed The Wonderful 101 as hard as they could in marketing, but the game sold poorly even by Wii U standards. For example, its first week placement in the UK gaming charts was at the disappointing and forgettable spot of 22. This stings even more because it was an example of a game that used the system's advantages incredibly well. On a happier note, The Wonderful 101 got a second lease on life when Platinum Games launched a Kickstarter campaign for a Nintendo Switch port that had all of its targets smashed in hours. This further demonstrated the love that the game had garnered amongst those who played it, and the curiosity it prompted from those who hadn't. Number 2. Batman: The Telltale Series. One of the most shocking video game falls from grace was the September 2018 reveal that Telltale Games was firing 90% of its staff and closing its doors. It seemed inconceivable, a juggernaut of storybook narrative games that only seemed to be getting bigger and bigger suddenly going bust. Apparently, in 2018, the bubble had quite simply burst. In the ensuing chaos, internal reports were revealed that out of all of the company's IP-based releases, only the first season of The Walking Dead and Minecraft had turned a profit. The studio studio's efforts with Batman were reported to have completely tanked. This was as big a surprise as the studio closing. You'd think anything with the Caped Crusader would have sold like hotcakes, especially high-quality games from a well-respected studio. Batman the Telltale series now has a bittersweet taste, knowing the damage it did to Telltale, but it remains a really fun look at the world's greatest detective, superbly played by Troy Baker. The story takes some interesting liberties, but it's pretty engaging throughout. Additionally, the upgraded engine allowed Telltale to really give the game a perfect comic book aesthetic. The sequel is so-so, but Batman the Telltale series should be remembered for its quality and not for being the anchor that sank the ship. Number 1. Fallout 76. The idea of an online Fallout game is the stuff that dreams are made of. Upon release, Fallout 76 had far too many issues to be coming from such a beloved studio and franchise that had, at the time, a pretty good track record. Bugs and technical problems were a big contributing factor to its downfall, but many lamented how empty its open world felt. As such, it became the lowest scoring entry in the series. Whilst some stayed to review bomb the poor thing, most gamers moved on. The fans that stuck with Fallout 76, however, have since experienced a different game. Updates, and most prominently the free 2016 Wastelanders expansion, fixed a lot of the game's initial complaints. The world is now populated with NPCs and the quest system has been reworked entirely. The expansion even added a new tutorial quest to help onboard new players better. As with the main game, Wastelanders was similarly review bombed, which belays the fact that many players thought that it was the turning point the game needed. Despite being a 4-year-old title, thousands of gamers still concurrently play Fallout 76, building together, completing quests together, and having a wonderful time despite the hate that the game gets. With apparently 5 more years left on its roadmap, Fallout 76 is going to be around a lot longer than most people thought. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, and whilst you're down there, let us know of any video games that you've played that apparently bombed on release, whether that's review scores or sales, that you didn't think deserved the treatment they got. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. I've been Si from WhatCulture, and have a good week.